Or good afternoon, everybody. Oh, it's been a long day already. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Karen here, and we are about to get started with how to build your students' academic vocabulary, even if you only have 30 minutes per week. So for those of you who have been following me the last week or so on social media and have been getting my emails, you know that this past week we opened enrollment for our signature course, Language Therapy Advanced, that provides a language therapy system that helps to build vocabulary for students with processing issues. But what I wanted to do this week is talk a little bit about vocabulary selection, because that's actually, for a lot of us, that is the thing that we do first when we're trying to figure out how to remediate issues for students with language disorders. So today, I wanted to take a step back and talk about just that first step of vocabulary selection and why it's so important, and how we can take those initial steps in focusing our language therapy as SLPs so that we can figure out how to get a bigger bang for our buck when it comes to language therapy. So another thing is that, as I mentioned before, we opened enrollment for Language Therapy Advanced last week. However, I know that for a lot of people, for whatever reason, they might not be ready to join the full signature program. And so this week, I am actually running a special on the Vocabulary Foundation, which is a more introductory course that can guide you through those first steps if you aren't quite ready for that full Language Therapy Advanced program yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this presentation today. Again, I always like to do that right after we open enrollment for Language Therapy Advanced, because for people who aren't quite ready for that yet, and who want something that is more of a snippet just to help them get started, the Vocabulary Foundation would be a great place for them to start. But with that all being said, let's go ahead and get started with this quick presentation today. So one of the challenges that we face as SLPs is that we have limited time with our students, regardless of the setting. If we are working with school-age populations, a lot of times for students with language disorders, we've only got maybe 30, 40 minutes a week with them. And it seems like there's so many different skills that they need to target, or that we need to address with them, and just not enough time to do it. So we've got to figure out how to prioritize. And one of the challenges is that there are so many different language skills that we could be addressing. And so we want to figure out, where can we get the biggest bang for our buck? So I'm going to make the case today that that primary area that we should be addressing is vocabulary. And then I'm going to show you those first steps in figuring out how to do that. So you may, if you're here, have students who have language disorders on your caseload, and you may have in the past struggled to help them meet their language goals or succeed in school. So a lot of times these students are struggling to make progress with literacy. They might not be reading at grade level. They might have a hard time following directions in the classroom. They're the kids who we often hear for those processing referrals, where they just don't quite catch on to concepts that they're learning in the classroom. And so I want you to know that if you've ever experienced this issue, it's definitely not your fault. No one ever really showed us how to do this and how to prioritize our therapy correctly. A lot of times we actually, rather than not getting enough information, we almost get too much information. And so there are just so many different therapy materials out there, so many different options for us as SLPs, and it can be really hard to figure out where do we start when it comes to language disorders. And then also there are a lot of different opinions out there. I don't know why my little PowerPoint is going before I'm clicking here. A lot of as I was saying, that there's not really a clear consensus about what SLPs should be doing when it comes to language and literacy. So a lot of us are kind of, if you're doing what I was doing, I was kind of guessing or really treating the symptoms. So working on things like reading comprehension, working on WH questions, things like that, because those are really the symptoms. But the problem with that, of course, is that when we are addressing those high-level comprehension issues, a lot of times we're addressing more of the symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. And if we're actually going to get the biggest bang for our buck and make measurable gains, we've got to address those processing problems at the root cause. So I have experienced this problem firsthand, and I found that in my early years, when I was just starting to figure this out, that there seemed to be a clear pattern when I was looking at a lot of the language referrals that I was getting from teachers. So this was during my doctoral program, and I was doing a lot of research on vocabulary and literacy, and I was noticing at the time, because I was on the student problem solving team, and this was the team in the building where I was working that would field all the academic referrals. So whenever a student had some type of an issue, the teacher was concerned, they would refer them to this team and we'd figure out what to do next. And for a lot of the cases where I ended up doing the language referrals or doing a language evaluation and actually qualifying the students, I found that there was a common pattern and a common symptom that when we really got down to the nitty-gritty of what was going on with the student, it seemed to be the case with the majority of these students who were getting referred. And that was the most common complaint was vocabulary. Now, the teachers weren't always articulating this exactly, but when I would actually look for patterns, it seemed to all point to this. For example, I would have students, one student, she wasn't making progress in reading. She wasn't processing what she was reading. And her teacher said, well, we were reading the story about the ghost in the attic, and she didn't know what an attic was. So she had no context for the story. She didn't understand it. Again, vocabulary. She didn't know what that word meant. Other cases where the teacher would say, you know what, it's like he's trying to describe something and he's trying to come up with words when he's writing or when he's just interacting in class, but words that he should know, he just can't come up. He can't come up with the word. And when I'd actually looked, when I actually looked at their scores on the tests that I would end up doing, a lot of times it would be low in vocabulary. And then when I actually looked into the research on vocabulary, again, during my doctoral work, I found that there were some consistencies. And this totally made sense based on those high-level symptoms that were causing the teachers to refer to begin with. And that was that those vocabulary skills are necessary in order to comprehend. So it totally made sense why those students were not processing when they were reading and not making progress, because we need to be able to comprehend at least 90 to 95% of the words in the text in order to understand it. So in other words, if we don't know enough of the words, then we're not going to be able to make sense of the text that we're reading. It's why when I was in grad school, had such a difficult time with my craniofacial anomalies textbook, and it took so many times to read that text over and over and still didn't understand it. But I could go read one of my Jane Green novels and I would comprehend it the first time because the vocabulary was simply easier. It was much easier to process. The cognitive load wasn't as great, and I could make sense of what I was reading. So the problem is that with a lot of these students, they just did not have the vocabulary in order to support that comprehension. And then, of course, they weren't reading as much as their peers, which meant that they were not getting as much exposure to vocabulary. And so it was kind of a double whammy where they weren't reading, they weren't comprehending, and then they weren't also getting that exposure because they were having a hard time keeping up with those more difficult texts. So I found that there were a lot of other consistencies, again, that those vocabulary skills in the early grades can often predict which students will struggle in the later grades. And there's a lot of other research aside from this study that just shows that those underlying language skills, if we don't support those skills, then those high level skills, like reading comprehension, they're just not going to, hold on, I'm gonna switch my screen here so that this stops jumping on me. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I found that if those students did not have those vocabulary skills in the early grades, then often those were the kids who were likely to continue to be weak readers. And the thing is that if we work on those reading comprehension skills and those high level skills, like, stating the main idea, predicting, and all those other things like getting the gist, inferencing, a lot of times those skills are really important. But if we jump right to those skills when our students don't have that foundation, what happens is that the students are not able to benefit from that comprehension instruction yet. So that's why a lot of our students are often struggling to make progress with those general education curriculums and those activities that they're doing in the classroom. And that's where we come in. So we know that vocabulary is correlated with reading performance and overall academic performance. And that's why it makes sense that a lot of these students on my caseload, a lot of those students who were getting referred to that academic referral team, were having those issues with vocabulary. And here's the thing, is that we know that, again, the teachers are often working on comprehension instruction in the classroom, and a lot of times that's working for a lot of the students, but it's not working for our students because they don't have the adequate linguistic skills to be able to benefit from that high level comprehension. So we don't want to try to teach everything. What we want to try to do is really get at that root cause that is contributing to that cognitive overload that's causing our students to not comprehend. And the great part about that is that no one understands vocabulary better than you because you are the language expert. A lot of times teachers do embed vocabulary instruction in their classroom instruction, but they're not going to be able to deliver it with the intensity that your students need. And that's why it's so important that you add that strategic element that others can't, because the interventions that you are going to deliver are going to be a lot more intensive and strategic with regards to those concepts that you're able to focus on. A lot of times the teachers just can't provide that level of intensity because they've got to keep moving along with the curriculum. But the thing is about this is that, okay, so we know that we need to target vocabulary. So we know that part of that is figuring out the actual content that we're going to teach. But the problem with that is that, as I mentioned before, our students are likely already behind. And then if we take the other thing into account, which is that they're probably not reading at the same level as their peers, and they're probably not reading as much, often because they simply don't like it, because they haven't been successful, because we're not likely to do something where we don't feel competent. What happens there is that they are learning vocabulary at a slower rate than their peers, simply because of that, because they're not getting that exposure to sophisticated vocabulary. So we want to start to close that gap, but the rate of vocabulary learning for students in the school age, if they're getting a lot of exposure, is really rapid. Some kids can learn between 3,000 to 5,000 words per year if everything is going well. But for our students who are struggling, they might only learn 300 to 900 words per year. So if you think about the amount of vocabulary that we'd have to make up, that's really a lot. So the bottom line is that you can't do it all. You can't teach students all the words that they need to know. So we need to be highly strategic in the concepts that we embed into our therapy. And we want to figure out how we can teach our students the concepts and the words that will help them teach themselves. So we want to teach words that are very important to them, that are going to facilitate learning of more difficult words. So then the question becomes, how do we do that? Because that's essentially our first step in really focusing our language therapy. So what I did when I initially realized that vocabulary was kind of my main thing that I should be focusing on is that I tried to reinforce all of the vocabulary that came from the classroom. Let me fix that. But I was kind of scrambling around doing social studies, science, reading vocabulary. There were a bazillion vocabulary lists, and I just could not keep up. And I felt like I was just more of a glorified tutor, if anything, just drilling these vocabulary words. And I thought, this is not very strategic, and this is not going to help my students. I could simply send these cards home and have their parents do this. I don't need to be spending therapy time drilling these flashcards. I need to figure out how to make my intervention more strategic by only focusing on the words that they really need to know, because I just couldn't keep up with that number of words with the intensity that I needed to do, because a lot of times I was needing to do extension activities to really solidify those word meanings. So I couldn't keep up with all the vocabulary that that was coming from the classroom, but then I realized that I didn't have to, because I stumbled upon the framework that was described in the book. You're probably familiar with it, possibly, called Bringing Words to Life by Isabel Beck, Margaret McEwen, and Linda Kukin. And that was published back in 2002. Again, there have been other versions and editions of this framework published since then, but this was the original framework. And so back in the early 2000s, Beck et al. Explained that vocabulary can be organized into 3 tiers or kinds of words. And this can help us to be more strategic in the way that we deliver vocabulary intervention, just because we know that we're not going to be able to teach all of the words directly and directly talk about every word that our students might need to know. So there are those tier 1 words that are conversational words that happen often. They're easy for most kids, words like dog and pencil. Yes, kids, some kids might not know these words, but for most kids, because they have enough exposure with these words, they're just not that difficult. We don't necessarily need to spend a ton of time on these words, because kids often know these words already just from conversation. Then we have tier 2 words that happen often, but they're difficult for students. So again, the frequency is similar in that they both, tier 1 and tier 2, both happen often, but the difference with tier 2 is that they are difficult. So this could be words like explain or persuade. So words that are more academic and that tend to occur across multiple types of academic settings. So not necessarily content specific, like they only occur in science. They are going to occur across all of those academic settings, and then often in texts as well, because we know that text language is more sophisticated than conversational language. And then finally, we've got tier 3 words that happen in specific content area units. They're only needed within those specific units or discussions. So an example would be science or social studies vocabulary. This could be also industry specific. Mechanics or engineers might have words specific to their industries that most people wouldn't use on a regular basis. But examples of that would be vertebrate, which is science vocabulary, and preamble, which would be more of social sciences vocabulary. But the point is that we don't use these words that often. They do tend to be difficult for students because of that, because they're more complex, but they just don't occur as often. So with all of that in mind, according to, let me go back here, according to Beck et al., they prioritize the tier 2 words across the academic settings because they occur frequently and they are difficult. So they're higher priority because they happen a lot. We don't necessarily have to focus as much time on the tier 3 words outside of those content areas, because they're just not, it's just not as efficient, because the words don't happen as often. And then with we choose tier 2 over tier 1 because the tier 1 words, kids usually get those on their own, so we don't have to help them with them. So that's the general philosophy behind this. But the problem with this framework when it comes to SLPs is that I did start to use it But I ran into a problem, and a lot of other people and again, a lot of other SLPs have run into this problem as well, which is that I realized, you know what? I still don't think I can get to all of these tier 2 words. And the problem with that is that you've prioritized the words, so that helps, but then there's still a lot of words. So even if you did prioritize and only worked on the tier 2 words, we still can't get to all of them. Now, teachers often have a curriculum. For example, a lot of reading curriculums have tier 2 words. So in the English and language arts, a lot of those words that they need to know would fall in this tier 2 category, but teachers might have a 45-minute period every day that they can go through all of these words. And often they don't necessarily go through them with as much depth as our students might need. So the problem is that this is a good framework, and it certainly works for the general education curriculum, but that's exactly the point, is that it was designed for the general education curriculum. It was designed to enhance that, that instruction that's supposed to work for at least 80% of the kids, if we're thinking RTI pyramid, but our kids, remember, aren't in that 80%. And we are not general education teachers. We're not operating within the same instructional framework. We have to figure out how to remediate vocabulary for kids who need an additional level of intensity and who only might come to us maybe for 40 minutes a week one time. So we can't necessarily use this same framework like teachers can. We've got to make it even more strategic. And then there's the other problem, is that sometimes we might even find that because our students are struggling, they don't understand the tier 3 words, and sometimes teachers want you to work on them. You're not always sure what to do. And then the other challenge is that some of my students didn't understand the tier 1 words. So yeah, most kids can understand the tier 1 words, but remember, we're working with kids who are struggling, who have weaker vocabularies. We know that our students aren't most students, and we sometimes have to work on some of those tier 1 words. It can be hard to move up to those tier 2 words when our students aren't even getting those more basic words. So there are a lot of times when this framework is great as a starting point, but we do need to have a way to tailor it a little bit to what we do as SLPs. So I ran into these problems too. And if you're nodding your head, again, this is the problem with just taking this framework at face value, because when we think about our students with language disorders, again, remember that we're not teachers. We can't use the same framework that the teachers use. And then also, our students need a little bit more. Our students, they're going to need us to have a little bit more intensity when it comes to what we actually do in order to teach those words. And then in some respects, our students also, hold on, I'm jumping around between my slides here. Okay, here we are. So we're not teachers, so our students need more and our students actually need less. So what I mean by this is, again, our students need more in that they need more intensity, but they need less, and that sometimes we actually we're better serving them by focusing on fewer words. So what that actually means for our students is fewer words, more intensity with those words. So what we've essentially got to do is take this framework and funnel it down a little bit more. So we can't just say, okay, I'm just going to target tier 2 words. We've got to back up and figure out why those tier 2 words were selected in the first place. So essentially, we're using a similar thought process, but we're just backing up to make sure it still applies to our students. So what we want to do is ask ourselves a couple different questions. So we want to be able to ask ourselves, number one, what words are students going to encounter frequently? Again, that is how they determined the difference between things like tier 2 and tier 1. And then we also have to determine how to select words that are going to be high priority. So we want to go back to those initial questions of why are certain words tier 2 and why are certain words tier 3 or tier 1. So we've got to come back to those questions of what words are the highest priority for our students and what words are going to result in increased vocabulary, what words are going to increase understanding of more difficult words. So essentially we've got to use those tier 2 words as a starting point, but then what we want to do is go back to those questions to just help cross-reference to ensure that it still applies. Because what that might mean is that sometimes we might have those tier 1 words on our list if it's appropriate for our students. But the challenge with this is that sometimes it can be difficult to figure out exactly how to do this and how to navigate, especially when you might be getting pressure from coworkers to do things a certain way. I know that when I was in my initial job at an elementary school, I would get a lot of pressure from teachers, and not that they were trying to be nasty or anything, it's just that they were trying to figure out how to help their students and they weren't exactly sure where I fit into that puzzle. And the problem was neither did I, so I couldn't educate them and help to clarify how they could utilize my services the best. So the problem was that they would come to me with certain words that they'd want me to work on or certain concepts or worksheets, and I didn't always know how to respond, and I didn't always know how to give them research or validation to actually show why I was doing things the way I was doing, especially when it came to my evaluations and when I would have to figure out why I was doing what I was doing. I see a couple questions popping up. I know that a lot of you are between therapy groups. Since this is a Facebook Live, this is going to be up on my page afterwards, so you can always hop in if you need to hop off now. This will be up on my page. You'll just need to scroll down the newsfeed and see it. So essentially what I found that I needed was a way to take this tiers of vocabulary framework that is a great framework, but was designed for teachers. So what I essentially needed, and what you will actually need if you want to figure out how to focus your vocabulary the right way, is that you actually need access to those lists of high priority words across grade levels so that you can see an example of what types of words you might pick. Because a lot of times the biggest challenge that people have with this tiers of vocabulary framework and with figuring out why words are selected and figuring out how how to prioritize and how to look at the curricular materials that your students have and figure out, okay, which ones would be the best for me to address in my therapy and work into the vocabulary exercises that I'm doing. It can be really difficult to figure out what's a tier 2 word, what's a tier 3 word, and should my students be doing tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 1? It can be really difficult to determine that if you don't have access to a big list of words and see what are examples of words that students are being exposed to across different grade levels in those elementary years. So really one of those first things that you need is just access to those words so that you can see examples. And then additionally, we need a guideline to figure out how many words we can realistically target every week. A lot of times we want to be more intensive and we want to figure out, we don't want to feel rushed and feel like we have to get through a certain number of words. We want to be able to really dive deep and teach our students strategies for learning words rather than just, plowing through a list of flashcards or worksheets or whatever. So we want to figure out, okay, how do I fine tune my therapy so that I don't feel like I'm missing things? So we need a clear guideline for that. And then we also need how to determine, we need a way to determine how our students really know a word. So we need some type of a measurement tool that will actually help us guide our students through explaining words to see if they're actually becoming more aware of those different features of a word, like the different semantic features that are going to give us an indication of if our students are becoming more linguistically aware when we're doing our vocabulary activities, because again, a lot of what you're doing in therapy is going to be more about working your students through the process. So we need a way to see if our students are actually really developing a deeper understanding of those words that we're addressing in therapy. And we need to figure out how to evaluate our students' vocabulary, because a lot of times we do need to integrate a mix of standardized and non-standardized procedures. We need the standardized procedures so that we can have those objective numbers for diagnosis, but then we need those non-standardized procedures because we know that a lot of those standardized vocabulary assessments just require students to identify a word or name a word, and we know that vocabulary learning goes way deeper than that, and we don't want to miss out on good information that shows if our students are making progress. So we need to know that in order to figure out what are those first steps in addressing vocabulary in therapy. And then finally, we need to have a really solid understanding of where classroom instruction falls short so that we know how to fill the gaps, so that we don't, when we do start working on vocabulary and we do start selecting those words, that we can kind of ditch that feeling of I'm a glorified tutor who's just kind of drilling flashcards. Able to have that strategic focus in our instruction so that we know that we're actually doing something that's different from what they're getting in the classroom and from what, you know, an untrained parent volunteer could do if they were just, you know, coming in and kind of helping students with some extra work. So the thing is that the first step in learning how to do this is knowing how to, and is having a good understanding of what words are most important to integrate into our therapy, and understanding our role in that process and how it's different, and understanding, okay, how do I get a good solid understanding of how students actually learn words? So that's exactly what I will show you how to do. I don't know if let me see here. I've got to get my page up really quickly here. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that I was going to be talking a little bit about a program that might be right for you if you are an SLP who has struggled to really create that system for language therapy. You felt like you don't know where to start. And maybe you looked into Language Therapy Advanced this past week, but you figure you weren't quite sure if you were ready to jump in feet first yet. And you want to just start with those first steps so you can get a feel for exactly how to start adding that vocabulary focus to your therapy. So if that sounds like you, or even if you're in Language Therapy Advanced, but you want to just really solidify that first step of vocabulary selection, then the vocabulary foundation would be your ideal first step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the link to the sign up page in the comments so that you can click on that and get the information. But what the vocabulary foundation is like Language Therapy Advanced. It's an online program for SLPs where I guide you through the process of vocabulary selection. And really the purpose of this program is to give you that deep understanding of how we learn words, why it's different for students with language disorders, how the vocabulary intervention is going to be different for you versus a classroom teacher, and exactly how you can articulate that to your colleagues who might be questioning why you might be working on certain words. And it will show you exactly how to prioritize so that you know how to establish that baseline data to figure out if your students need that intervention, and then also how to figure out what words to target and how many words you can target and over what time period. So there's a total of, again, it's a 3-hour online program. It's self-led, so that means that you can log in whenever you want and watch the trainings. And how it works is that we start off, there's 3 separate modules. Module 1 is all about defining your role. And I know that it seems, you know, for a lot of people, it seems counterintuitive, but if you do not understand your role, then no one else that you work with will either. So it's so important that we understand why word learning is different for the students on your caseload, why the general education instruction and a lot of things that they're working on in there won't be appropriate and won't be enough, and where you come in to help fill that gap. So that will be key for you if you've ever had someone question why you're even working on vocabulary, why you aren't exactly doing those worksheets that might be being sent down to the therapy room with your students, and why what you do has to be extremely strategic and focused. And then in Module 2, we get down to word selection. So what words would be examples of Tier 2, and the different tiers of vocabulary. What are examples of words that you might need to be focusing on with your students? Where do you go to get those words? How many can you target and over what time period? And then in Module 3, we talk all about getting that deeper understanding of your students' vocabulary skills. So we talk through both formal assessment procedures out there, and then we also talk about non-standardized options so that you can actually monitor your students' progress and take data, because a lot of times you're just going to need a little bit more than what those formal assessments are going to offer you so that you can get a deeper understanding of your students' vocabulary skills. I actually used this framework and this method of vocabulary selection with a couple different case studies. I've mentioned Nick before, but this is a student who was a mild speech and language only student who did, again, he started off with formal language scores in the mid-70s in kindergarten, and he was also very low when it came to literacy scores. I for sure thought he was going to need some supplemental intervention. But when we made vocabulary our main focus during his elementary years, by third grade, his language scores were within the normal range, and he did not need an IEP. And then I've also had cases where for this particular student, I'll call him Ryan. He was on the autism spectrum and had social skills that we were working on, but he also had some issues with vocabulary and language processing. He started off in kindergarten with a one-on-one aide and in the special education classroom for most of the day. And what I was able to do, and what we were able to do collaboratively with the special ed staff, was when I made vocabulary the main focus, so I was seeing him for 60 minutes a week. 30 minutes of that time we focused on vocabulary. So the language processing activities and the language processing component of therapy was all focused on building his vocabulary. And then the other time we focused on pragmatics and social skills. And what I was able to do, by the time he reached fourth grade, he was in the general education classroom 80% of the time, and we were able to drop the language processing goals. And so he still was on my caseload, but we didn't need to work on everything. We just were focusing on those social skills at that point. So this was a case where he got significantly more independent because we really narrowed our focus in therapy to just a couple key things so that we could start chipping away and peeling away those layers of that onion. So this is exactly what I used. These were the first steps that I used for the students, and I show you that process in the Vocabulary Foundation course. So for the Vocabulary Foundation this week, the reason I'm mentioning it is because we are actually running a special promotion this week. It is actually $100 off, so you will pay 2/3 of what you normally would be investing in your tuition. So what you'll get when you sign up for the Vocabulary Foundation is the course modules that include 3 hours worth of training that will guide you through exactly what I just explained. So how to pick the vocabulary words, how to focus your therapy, how to really own your role and explain that to other people, and then how to establish those first steps of evaluating your students so that you know where they stand, and so that you're able to track and monitor progress. So you'll learn in the program, again, we talk about how to approach vocabulary instruction and how it's different for students with language disorders, how to distinguish yourself from the teacher and pick the right words for therapy, how many words to target, and then the most efficient ways to evaluate vocabulary. So again, this is a separate program from Language Therapy Advance. So what essentially vocabulary foundation, the way that they are different is that the vocabulary foundation is those first steps. So it just will address that focus of how you pick those words and how you differentiate yourself from the teacher. And then language therapy advanced picks up where we leave off and shows you the how-to. So how do you actually study those words in therapy? So ideally, they're designed to complement each other. I know that a lot of people find that they really have a good complete system when they use both of them together. And again, the reason that I'm mentioning the vocabulary foundation this week would be for people who wanted to start off with those first steps if they weren't quite ready to fully dive in. So for those of you in Language Therapy Advanced, if you're not in the Vocabulary Foundation, you're certainly welcome to take advantage of this special promotion this week. However, you're welcome to go through Language Therapy Advanced and then afterwards see if you need to fill in the missing pieces of what you'll learn in the Vocabulary Foundation. So sometimes people will go through Language Therapy Advanced and then think, okay, I want to back up and build some of those first steps and just really solidify my knowledge. So sometimes people choose to just take one course or the other, but it does make sense. They were designed to complement each other. So again, the goal is to help your students guide you through those first steps in making real measurable progress in school, because you're targeting those root causes of those language processing issues. And I've spent the last 10 years doing research and trial and error, but I want to help you get on the fast track and just really have a good system for picking those vocabulary words. So something else you'll get with the program, again, you get the course modules, you get a entire list. Again, it's called the 540 Tier 2 words. So what that is an ebook that has 540 different Tier 2 words that would appear across general education curriculums from K through 8. So they're divided up by nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and there are words that are taken from different curriculums across the different grade levels so that you know exactly where to start with picking Tier 2 words, and you know exactly what types of words students are learning across the grade levels. And then for those students who might have more difficulty with again, those Tier 2 words, who might need to start with more basic vocabulary, I do include the basic concepts for language therapy. So some of those words that might be considered Tier 1, but might be appropriate for some of your students if the Tier 2 words are more difficult, if you're going through the process and realize, you know what, I need to back up. Additionally, what you'll get is I'll also give you 2 different protocols. There is the formal assessment for vocabulary, which guides you through some different options as far as formal assessments out there. So formal standardized procedures, and then also a functional vocabulary assessment, which will guide you through a non-standardized procedure that you can use to track and progress monitored in your therapy. So again, this course is normally $297 if you go to my website, but for this week only, it is $197 until Friday at midnight. So for those of you who aren't quite sure where to start with your language therapy and your vocabulary intervention, and you want a structured way to select the right vocabulary that is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, and be able to clarify exactly why you're doing what you're doing in your therapy so you can really own your role and be seen as that leader in your building, the Vocabulary Foundation is for you. So all you need to do to join me this week in the Vocabulary Foundation is click that page that I shared in the comments. That will take you to the sign up page that'll give you all the details of the modules. There'll be some FAQs on there, so for some additional questions. If you're watching this Facebook Live and you have additional questions, you can email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. I'm going to type this in the chat right now. There we go. So any additional questions about the course, email me. Again, for this week only, we have got a special where you can get it for $197, normally $297, but if you join by Friday, you'll be able to get access to all of this for just $197 so that you can build the vocabulary foundation that your students need to succeed and get on the right track with your language therapy. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in this afternoon and for watching if you're watching later. Again, this promotion goes until the end of the week, and it is designed to help you figure out how to really make the most of that therapy time. We know that we don't have as much time as we'd like with our students, so we want to figure out how to make it focused, make it efficient, and work on the concepts that are going to set our students up for success. So with that, we will wrap up for this afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Email me with questions. Click on that sign up page to get more information. And I hope to see you, again, hope to see you on Facebook or in the comments later. And also hope to see you in the members area.